friends, and welcome back to another episode of Navigating Wellness. Now, today's episode may be a somewhat heavy topic, and it may ruffle a few feathers, and I don't say that just to be dramatic, because I too, for a very long time, was not ready to hear this message. But just remember, this is my perspective, and like everything else in life, perspectives evolve. So take what resonates with you and leave the rest. My intention here is not to guilt trip anyone or to try and place judgment on anyone. Just remember that I've been on both sides of the fence, quite literally, and I've been back and forth with a number of these diets. What I'm sharing with you today is based on my current state of consciousness, and like I said, everything has a tendency to evolve. So with that said, let's jump into today's video. So let me share a bit of backstory that can hopefully contextualize a lot of what I'm going to be sharing in today's video, and that can hopefully put things into much better perspective. So I didn't grow up in a home that was vegetarian or vegan. My family ate meat, and I grew up with a lot of the conventional BS that basically indoctrinates most of society, thinking that consuming milk and cheese is essential for us to get adequate amount of calcium. We needed to be consuming things like chicken and fish in order to get the recommended daily protein intake. And so all this conventional stuff was generally heavily indoctrinated both in my family and I would say generally the masses too. And there was this belief that if you had a vegetarian diet, you wouldn't be getting adequate amounts of nutrients, and that it's just not a viable solution for many of us, because many of us fall victim to what conventional wisdom tends to spill out. And we find ourselves very vulnerable to the opinions of medical professionals, thinking that they are the experts, they should be choosing what we should be eating. They are the ones that study in depth the diet of humans and know best what's for us. Unfortunately, that's the way how conventional wisdom goes, and no one is really taught to listen to their bodies and to better understand what are the body's needs. Now, I'm not talking about the mind, because the mind will tend to lure you to things that appeal to your taste buds that perhaps aren't rooted in what your body truly needs. So like I said, I came from a pretty standard Indian diet. But over time, I kept switching from vegetarian to vegan, vegan back to vegetarian by incorporating things like ghee and maybe sometimes cheese. But this back and forth kept taking place, and I wasn't fully plant-based until a shift in consciousness took place. I also kept going back and forth between the different reasons that I will share with you later in this video for adopting a plant-based diet. At this point in life, and perhaps many of you end up in a similar predicament, when you start to question things, when you start to look at the world and the sense of reality just doesn't make sense anymore. And when you watch the movie The Matrix, you tend to get this feeling that, wait a minute, this isn't a movie anymore, it's actually a documentary. And that's the moments when you really started questioning everything about reality, from the food system, the medical system. Everything starts to take on a different perspective. And you start to realize the distortions, the manipulation, the delusions that are basically overwhelming most of society today. Because so many people walk in a state of trance, and the minute you question them, they label it as a conspiracy. It's unfortunate that much of this actually gets labeled as conspiracy, because in just a few years down the line, it all ends up becoming the truth and something that becomes a normal part of reality. But unfortunately, because so many find themselves in the state of delusion, we don't end up taking on a much more conscious, aware state of living when it comes to the foods that we consume, the environments that we live in, and the overall perspective of life. Because generally the system tends to result in us delegating a lot of our conscious awareness to the matrix itself, rather than start becoming much more aware and starting to ask why we do certain things, why we have certain practices. Because it's this curiosity that many children have to always ask their parents, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Why do I do that? But now it's starting to continue that practice of curiosity, to hold on to it and question everything that we are doing. Sometimes things that we've been doing for a number of years, like certain diets that we've been following, certain medications that people take, to start really asking why. Why is it that we consume certain foods? What are we not perceiving about certain things that we consume? And it's through this questioning approach that leads us down this rabbit hole. Now, many of us who go down this rabbit hole start to realize these distortions and start to come to new perspectives, to perspectives that lead us to what I think is greater levels of conscious awareness, where we start to make much more consciously aware decisions. And yes, it didn't come overnight. And like I said, there's been a lot of back and forth. So I'm not putting myself out there and saying, hey, I know all the answers, or that I'm much more consciously aware. It's something that we go through this process, the cycles, and it's through this curiosity that we come to these different states of awareness. When we consume meat and dairy, especially meat and dairy from industrialized sources, we're not just ingesting food anymore. We're absorbing the energy, the trauma, the karma of another being. And these animals are often in this constant state of fear, anxiety, confinement, conditions that are far more cruel than what they would face in the wild. And their trauma becomes a natural part of us because we end up consuming the animal and making it part of us when we consume meat. So not metaphorically, literally, energetically, as well as biologically. And the worst of all is most of us don't even realize this. And that's because by the time the burger hits your plate, it's already been scrubbed clean of any of this context. Like, it's neatly packaged, it's brightly labeled, it's masked in these spices and sauces that make it so alluring. And the suffering, all of that is hidden behind this convenience. So here's the part where it gets weirder and gets much more deeper, and the part that I alluded to in the beginning of this video. When we unknowingly participate in these systems of trauma, suffering, violence, we essentially creating space, karmatically, energetically, for this violence and trauma to reflect back at us. It's one of those universal laws that no one generally cares about because we're not made aware of it through a number of the traditional schools, practices, indoctrination that we usually come to. And this is deliberately done so once you start to understand the way in which this matrix operates. Because essentially there are forces that actually benefit from this. So whether you want to think about it as the industries or perhaps look deeper at these entities that are in fact benefiting from it, they design these systems specifically to keep human consciousness low, to keep it dulled. Why? Because when we weigh down from a consciousness perspective and we start to make more and more unconscious choices, we're easier to control. We're less likely to awaken to the reality. And that's when we become much more vulnerable, because we start making all these choices that in fact enslave us. Now you may think that this kind of sounds like kind of like a sci-fi movie. But to others, especially those of you who have started to kind of question the matrix, started to look beyond the matrix, then this probably hits a bit too close to home. Let me be clear, not all types of meat consumption are created equal. Many of you may cite traditional cultures, practices, ancestors consuming meat and justify it on that basis. However, traditional cultures often consumed animal products with reverence, with spirituality, with blessings to the animal that they consumed, and a much more deeper connection to the food that they consumed. They didn't go on this rampage trying to annihilate as many animals as possible and turn it into some sort of commercialized venture, which is what takes place in the industrialized world today. What we have now is nowhere near sacred. It's a very mechanical form of suffering and torture that's inflicted on animals. It's mass production that puts profits ahead of life, of spirituality, of connection. And so when someone says, well, my ancestors consumed meat, recognize that it was not with that same sense of connection, with that same sense of spirituality, and it was nowhere near the level of violence and suffering that is inflicted on animals today. had someone tell me or give me a lecture that consuming vegan foods is the most unhealthiest choice I could ever make because it's full of sugary treats and processed foods that are just not good for your health. And yes, that may be very true. There are a number of people that consume these vegan foods that are heavily processed, and they're often very expensive because they have the labeling of a healthy food. And this is partly what the Matrix does to us. It provides us with this contradiction to lure people away from adopting a healthier diet. The way I look at it, there's three types of vegan diets. There's the one which is the ethical diet. And most of the people who take on this stream or follow a plant-based diet for ethical reasons generally do so because they are there for animal rights and to ensure that they are living from an ethical position. And they will tend to make those exceptions and be much more open to consuming processed junk food varieties of vegan foods. Then you have the vegans or the plant-based people who will adopt this approach for health reasons. And these are the people that generally stick to a vegan diet, but will try and stick as much as possible to whole foods, organic foods, and tend to make sure that they're consuming foods that are of a high frequency. So the unprocessed versions, they're not the sugary treats, and they're generally much more beneficial to your health. And this is the version that I think has those really positive benefits for our overall health, where you don't fall victim to marketing and things like that, and you opting for natural whole foods that we can probably grow in our own gardens and avoid much of the commercialization. Then you find the hybrid approach, where a person generally tends to adopt both these reasons, to try and be healthy as well as for the ethical reasons. And these people may be somewhat open to consuming processed versions now and again. However, the primary objective being to also be healthy and to be ethical at the same time. So they tend to also adopt much more of the whole food, organic type lifestyle, but occasionally make those exceptions when the whole foods are not readily available or may not be convenient. For example, if you're traveling and you don't want to support a business that serves meat products, then you'll generally try and opt for a vegan restaurant or vegan place because you know that whatever you eat on the menu, it's something that's in alignment with your ethical position and values in life. I tend to see myself very much in that hybrid approach for now, because there are always those times when it may not be as readily accessible, and you may have that sweet tooth that you may want to satisfy every now and again. And then these hybrid options can tend to be a much more easier way to facilitate our transition to going to that full health-based option. And sometimes, just like I said, when you're traveling, it may not be as convenient to go entirely strict on a full-fledged vegan diet. Here's the part that I always tend to come back to. If humanity were ever to succeed in collapsing this industrialized dairy and meat complex, I think we'll experience quite a huge shift in consciousness. And this is my own personal perception or perspective on this thing. And the reason being is it's such a large component of society today that it has such a huge effect on our overall consciousness as well as the consciousness of the collective, that when that industry does end up ever collapsing, I think it will bring about quite a huge shift in the collective consciousness of humanity. And I think that is probably one of those key ingredients that can help to almost untangle us from this matrix structure and to set more of us free and to recognize reality and to break many of us free from this enslavement that we've been subject to. And that is why probably I hammer on this topic for so much, is because I truly believe that this is one of those fundamental core underpinnings that is holding back consciousness at a collective level. And I know more and more people are waking up to this, and that is definitely some really positive catalysts that are helping make this transition. And that is why we're also seeing the frequency of the planet increasing and more people becoming aware of the manipulations that we've been subject to. And again, this is just my take, but maybe one day we'll look back and say, maybe consuming a vegan diet was that right thing to do. And maybe it is the food that is the right source of fuel for this bioenergetic material that we have, which is our body. If any of this content resonates with you, please do hit that like button. Please share it with a friend who you know will appreciate these deeper reflections, and subscribe to this channel for much more unfiltered perspectives that are intertwined with a lot of spirituality and deeper reflections. With that, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.